Hey, Jonah.
Hey, Peter. How are you?
Good. So we are doing another edition of Blogging Heads. Haven't done one in a while.
Yeah, I know. It's almost nostalgic.
So I think we were going to start with the underwear bomb. We're going to try to catch the end of this story. And I wrote a piece in the Daily Beast on Monday, basically playing off Dick Cheney. Put out this statement that Barack Obama is pretending we're not really at war, and Barack Obama seems to think we're not really at war. I thought, not surprisingly, it was a pretty lame statement, and the Obama people kind of quickly shot back with some quotes of Obama saying, in fact, that we are at war. But I was thinking about it and actually came to the conclusion that I think we're not at war with jihadist terrorism or whatever you want to call it. We obviously are fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but I think basically, to me, there are two kind of definitions of ways that we use the word war. The first one, which I think is the good one, is to suggest a military conflict. And while there are military conflicts going on, I think we're not at war with jihadist terrorism because I think it's not primarily a military conflict. I think, like the Cold War, there are military conflicts that take place, but it's primarily an ideological conflict, and our best strategy is to make sure that it doesn't become primarily a military strategy. That basically we're going to do better if we recognize that the military should be used pretty sparingly, which I think was also the wisdom, basically, of the way we fought the Cold War in our more successful moments. The other way we use war, and I think which is what allowed Obama to kind of embrace the term, is this idea that we use war to kind of connote, national mobilization. We're at war with poverty and cancer and drugs. And the more I think about it, the more I really, really dislike using the word war that way. I mean, I think, particularly for liberals, I think, who believe, conservatives do too, but liberals believe maybe even more emphatically that war is a degrading, awful, savage thing. It's really unfortunate that we've kind of sanitized the word by starting to apply it to all these domestic efforts, which are not really supposed to be savage and degrading at all. And that kind of use of war doesn't translate at all into countries that have experiences of having their cities bombed to rubble and foreign troops marching across their cities. And so I think that basically we should ditch the second definition of war, and by the standards of the first definition, war as military conflict, I think the quote unquote war on terror doesn't deserve the term or shouldn't have the term.
Yeah, well, let me start in the spirit of bipartisan equanimity by agreeing with you on one point.
That's where you always start. That's where we always start. It's never where we end.
Yes, it's like saying "nice doggy" until you can find a rock. No, but this is a big issue for me. The the whole moral equivalent of war thing. Which starts with William James and was sort of the abiding passion of the progressives and was the central rationale of the New Deal and the war on poverty and all of that. I agree with you entirely that there is no such thing as a metaphorical war, and that the last thing in the world we should want to do is try to emulate one or create one. That doesn't mean we can't have grand causes and rally around important things and all of the rest, but war is war. And trying to come up with a benign substitute for it is, one, impossible, and two, does exactly what you say it does. It diminishes the reality and the horror of actual wars. And I agree with you that conservatives are guilty of it sometimes too, but it has been a sort of central philosophical plank of progressivism and liberalism for a very long time that everything would be great if we could just rally around big causes the way we do when we're at war, but just not actually have any of the killing. And I think that is sort of fool's gold ideologically and politically, and it's dangerous, and I applaud you for wanting to abandon that. On the idea that we're not actually at war with Islamic terrorism or jihadism, I find you far less persuasive. I think that, first of all, the Cold War analogy, as you sort of hinted, it's not as useful to you as you seem to imply at times, because again, as you sort of suggested, the Cold War involved a lot of killing people. We had a lot of wars that were part of the Cold War. If you want to, do the subsidiary metaphor properly, we had a lot of battles that were part of the larger Cold War, and so the idea that somehow, it doesn't apply to the war on terror, which I think we both always conceded was a bad label. I mean, we're not at war against the tactic. We're at war against a specific bunch of actors. The war on terror does, regardless of the bad nature of the label, does seem to me to be perfectly legitimate as a war. There are two fronts, the Korea and Vietnam of the war on terror so far, or Afghanistan and Iraq. There are a lot of people talking about a third front might be Yemen. I hope that's not the case. And at the same time, there's sort of an implied straw man in the way you set this up. It's not as if the Bush administration ever claimed or said that Dick Cheney ever claimed or said that the war on terror is solely about military conflict. I mean, there was all sorts of public relations or propaganda, if you prefer, efforts. There was that put out by the State Department. There was all sorts of aid. There was all sorts of diplomacy, public education efforts at home, all sorts of rhetorical genuflections from President Bush about Islam being a religion of peace. And those were all part of the larger war on terror as well, just as visa programs in the 1960s were part of the Cold War. NASA was part of the Cold War.
Yeah, I'm not saying that people like Dick Cheney think that the war on terror is solely military. I think they think it's primarily military. I think that they think the balance is towards military action. That's a big part of that's a big part of understanding why we decided to invade Iraq. It's a big part of understanding why people believe that we should take military action against Iran. And I think that the reason the Cold War analogy is useful is the Cold War was not like World War II. I mean, that was the central insight of George Kennan's idea of containment, that Stalin was not like Hitler. We did not have to fight him directly and militarily. We should basically just have enough military strength to basically that as Kennan saw it, the military aspect would be secondary, and the important part would be rebuilding Western Europe and Japan economically, and then showing that ideologically we had something better to offer. So in that sense, I think Vietnam and Korea were not battles of the Cold War in the sense that Guadalcanal was a battle in World War II. World War II was a war. It was primarily a military conflict. The Cold War was not primarily a military conflict. We didn't go directly to war against the Soviet Union, even though many people who called it there were a group of people who preferred the term World War III or Third World War, like like James Burnham at the National Review, and that's partly because they wanted much more open to direct military conflict with the Soviet Union, with China, with Cuba, with Nicaragua. But I think the wisdom of Cold War, which was an oxymoron, a war that didn't get hot, was the idea that we were not actually going to have direct military conflict. And I think that was ultimately, and we won the Cold War without direct military conflict. We didn't win it because of Vietnam or Korea. I think we won it basically because of the economic stagnation and lack of freedom in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And so that's why I think there is a useful analogy here between the war on terror, where yes, there are military conflicts, but I think it is not and should not be seen, and is not by the Obama administration, I think, as primarily military. That I think the use of military force should be relatively infrequent and scarce.
Okay, so there are all sorts of ways we can go off on that tangent, or not tangent, but that point of view that we would probably disagree on. I'm just not all that convinced that you or Norman Podhoretz are correct that the Cold War. I love putting the two of you in the same sentence. That either of you are correct in your blinkered, backward-looking nostalgia for the Cold War. No, I don't think. I'm just not sure it's as useful a prism as a lot of people make it out to be. Soviet communism was a very different phenomenon than sort of Wahhabist, jihadist, whatever you want to call it. Islam, the way it works in these cultures is very different than the way it worked in the Soviet Union or in China or any of these places, and the geopolitical realities are just very different. That all said, where the public policy really hits the road, at least in response to the Christmas bomber, is this idea that somehow someone like the Christmas bomber should be treated like a guy who holds up a liquor store. And whether you agree or disagree with the larger paradigm about whether or not this is a broad military construct or broad military conflict or any of that kind of stuff, it seems to me that you can still have, whichever side you come out on that debate, you can still have a serious debate about how we should treat these unlawful combatants who are operating outside of the Geneva Conventions, outside of traditional criminal justice law, and or at least that would be how I would put it, and that therefore, just because even if you don't want to have this war paradigm that you're talking about, that doesn't mean that we should be Mirandizing every guy who tries to blow up a plane.
Well, I mean, I think the two are very interrelated. I mean, I think it was the Bush administration's repeated claims that we were at war, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but at war globally, were really central to the legal case they made for not offering some of these individual freedoms and due process protections to, and also for their warrantless wiretapping. So I think you're right that this. I mean, if I interpret you correctly, this debate about war is actually, I think, very related to the public policy question about how much we give, how much we give in the way of freedoms, due process protections to various people that we pick up in this struggle. And I think, what it really comes down to, I think, is there a risk of giving people greater protections? Yeah, I think there can be some kind of greater risk if you give people various forms of due process. I think where liberals and conservatives tend to diverge is liberals tend to believe that risk is often outweighed by the greater risk that comes from creating new sources of hatred and terrorism towards the United States by the United States not acting in a lawful and kind of humane way. And conservatives just seem generally unmoved by that argument because as far as I can understand, they tend to believe that basically these people hate us, will always hate us, and their hatred doesn't really have anything to do with what we actually do, and they generally tend to see America as pretty morally pure anyway. And,
well, let me ask you a question about that then.
Yeah.
Let's say that we got rid of Gitmo, right? Let's say Obama could have somehow gotten rid of Gitmo on day one of his presidency, which would have really bolstered and reinforced this new era theme that he was trying to put in. Do you think Al-Qaeda would have that would have been a serious blow to Al-Qaeda anywhere in the world? Do you think it would have truly affected in a measurable way its ability to recruit or launch attacks? Do you think there would have been lots of people leaving Al-Qaeda because of that?
Well, I think that's not exactly the right question. I mean, I think when you're talking about people who actually join a group like Al-Qaeda and are willing to actually attack the U.S., I think those people are impervious to this kind of thing. But I think those people swim in a larger sea, and that's what's really important. I mean, it's the analogy of whether the old lady across the street in the apartment who sees the drug deal going down and the murder going down, whether they feel okay enough about the police to basically ally themselves with the police. And I think, so those are the people who you're trying to influence, not the Al-Qaeda people per se, but the people who you might need to be informants or to tell the local police or the CIA or somebody what they see going down, or whether they hate the United States or feel so alienated from the United States or its local allies that they basically say, you know what, go ahead and blow up the building. I don't care. And I think with that softer group of people, I think Gitmo is one part of a larger constellation of U.S. actions that really does matter. I mean, I think Al-Qaeda has lost a lot of popularity in various different parts of the world. It's not all related to Obama and things he's done. A lot of it's related just to the fact that people tend to turn against Al-Qaeda because they kill so many innocent Muslims. But I think actually there has to some degree been a relationship between the new image that Obama put forward and some of the useful things that the U.S. has done, and the fact that Al-Qaeda has lost some support, which I think makes us safer.
Yeah, I guess I am one of those conservatives who's fundamentally unmoved by all of that. And just for whatever the merits of your argument, those aren't the arguments that the Obama administration makes. The Obama administration makes almost with the same regularity as blaming Bush for everything. The argument that they make is that it's a recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. And they did it on the Sunday shows this weekend, and they've done it for 2 years before that. And you offer no evidence that it's a recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. I know of no evidence that it's a recruiting tool of Al-Qaeda. I think it is something that a lot of people in Europe like to complain about, to Democratic, and people at Berkeley like to complain about. But I don't know that it's actually recruiting a lot of people to Al-Qaeda. And also this idea, I mean, tell me why.
What is recruiting a lot of people to Al-Qaeda?
Things like Gitmo. I mean,
I think there is evidence. I think you could find evidence that torture, either by the U.S. like the torture at Abu Ghraib, that there are individual cases of people of suicide bombers, say in Iraq, who later said they were motivated by what happened at Abu Ghraib, and there's certainly cases of
failed suicide bombers,
torture,
right?
Like sorry,
failed suicide bombers, right? Because
yes,
they didn't interview all the successful ones.
Yes, that's right. And I think there are other cases in which torture by U.S. allies. I think that, I'm not saying Ayman al-Zawahiri was ever a good guy, but I think if you look at his bio, for instance, the fact that he was tortured pretty badly by the Egyptians, I think did contribute to his radicalization. A lot of these guys get radicalized in prison in countries of U.S. allies where they get tortured. So I think I think the better argument, though slightly more complicated, does have to do with the larger sea in which they swim. But I think there probably are even individual cases of actual killers who are radicalized by being tortured themselves, or knowing someone who gets tortured, or knowing someone who gets killed. It's not that irrational.
I'm sure there are individual cases of it, but we're talking about, if you're going to define U.S. policy around the reactions of outlying individual anecdotal cases, that doesn't seem to me to be the smartest way to go. And I just think that the whole argument is radically overstated. And I'm not saying that there's no merit to it whatsoever, but there are all sorts of things that America should do, that even you would concede it should do, that are then used as recruiting tools by people who want to frame America's behavior in the worst possible light. And you can only concern yourself with that stuff so much. I mean, I think it's telling that China is hugely popular in many parts of the world, and what they do at home is in almost every way worse than anything America has ever done since the abolition of slavery. And yet,
yeah, but the difference is that the Chinese are doing it by and large to their own people. I don't think particularly that Al-Qaeda is terribly concerned about, for instance, the state of the way we treat American prisoners. But when it has to do with people from the Muslim world, whether they're at Gitmo or whether they're at some Abu Ghraib or some site, then I think it does have a much more significant impact on the way we're viewed in the Muslim world.
Yeah, but again, the Muslim Brotherhood has been around since the 1950s. Syed Qutb was writing in the 1950s and 1960s. Al-Qaeda was resurgent in the 1990s when we weren't doing almost any of these things that are supposedly radicalizing all of these people. It seems to me that everyone's got the causation kind of backwards. And
well, I mean, it depends. Look, there's some things. I think that there is no. I think you can make a very strong case that Al-Qaeda's decision to target the United States has a lot to do with the expansion of U.S. power into the Middle East in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, that doesn't mean that as you rightly say, that doesn't mean we should stop doing everything we're doing because Al-Qaeda doesn't like it. But I think Al-Qaeda was radicalized, turned against the United States, partly because of U.S. support for Israel, partly because of U.S. military presence in Saudi and the Arabian Peninsula as a result of the Gulf War. And so those things may be things that we should continue doing anyway, but I think that it's a mistake to try to suggest that basically somehow these people hate us and always hate us with no regard to our foreign policy. Our foreign policy, I think, is the central reason they hate us, even though there are only some aspects of our foreign policy that we should change.
Okay,
they don't hate us because of our domestic culture. I mean, that's for sure. Because they're not bombing. They're not interested in attacking countries that are far more libertine than us, but don't have global foreign policies.
Well, I'm sort of with you on that. I mean, I think they do hate our domestic culture. I mean, I think
they hate it, but I don't think they're willing to kill over it.
Probably not. Or at least some of them are. Most of them aren't. Let's say. Because we can go back and forth on this for a while.
Yeah.
I'd like to change it slightly to something where I think we're kind of more in agreement. That you said, I think you were saying in this conversation, maybe it was in the conversation we had before we taped, where the real fireworks fly. And you said something along the lines of, that you don't think the threat from Al-Qaeda is as serious or as sophisticated as people are making it out to be. And, well, I'm not sure I'm willing to go where you are completely on that. I do think that there are a couple things that I find kind of surprising. First of all, you're always reluctant to talk about this for fear that the bad guys are actually going to listen to you. But but since George Will did it on Sunday a little bit, I figure that bell has been rung. It is sort of astounding the sort of schoolboy fixation these guys have with airplanes. The ability to wreak havoc in the United States or in the West or whatever is not, our only Achilles heel is not airplanes. And yet these guys who are certainly not reluctant to kill Americans, right, or to kill innocent people, seem to think that if they don't go after airplanes, it's not worthwhile. And that, I think, is sort of foolhardy on their part, but also a certain sign of their lack of sophistication. As was, everyone talks about how, you can't start racial profiling. We can argue about racial profiling or religious profiling if you want, but because then Al-Qaeda will just adapt. I'm not very persuaded by that argument because I think that you could profile and still do other things, and it would still be fruitful to profile to some extent. But this guy paid in cash and didn't have any luggage. Now, surely if Al-Qaeda's been paying attention, they know that those are red flags. Why this guy couldn't have gone to the Goodwill in Amsterdam or whatever and filled a $10 bag with some bogus luggage and even gotten, if they were all that sophisticated, gotten someone's credit card. There's stories about how he didn't even have a passport. If they're that sophisticated, why didn't they do all of those things? And I think it's one of these things that is not much discussed out there because no one wants to talk about how they're not as big a threat as we're supposed to believe. But I just found it fairly shocking that after 10 years, this was one of their most sophisticated attacks.
Well, I think you and I do agree, but I was actually writing something about this, basically arguing that I think the lesson of this Christmas type bombing, I think, as you suggest, actually testifies to the limits of Al-Qaeda's ability, not the fact that that it's not as great. In the post 9/11 environment, the conversation was about Al-Qaeda doing something bigger. That was something that that was very important to the whole. Particularly something with WMD. That was that was maybe not quite conventional wisdom, but a very, very common statement. It turns out, I think, that WMD attacks are extremely difficult. Even the anthrax attack that killed 5 people, which was done by a highly, highly educated, it turns out, American microbiologist, only killed 5 people. And the Al-Qaeda attacks that they've managed to pull off around the world are much less sophisticated than the attack of 9/11. And I think it's because it's actually a bunch of guys just looking at the internet and looking at some discussion of how to build a bomb on the internet. That's really not enough. It's seeming you need some real sophisticated training, or you need someone to give you some devices that are not easily able to get. And so what we have is a bunch of guys who've gone to Pakistan, or in the case of this guy, gone to Yemen, and they've gotten something. They've gotten some training, and they've gotten maybe some devices, but the infrastructure of Al-Qaeda is simply far, far less capable of training, 19 people willing to kill themselves. Remember, they got that 19 people willing to kill themselves, and they trained them about how to be able to kill themselves, as opposed to one guy here. And Al-Qaeda just doesn't have nearly as sophisticated an infrastructure, I think, to basically train people, lots and lots of people, so they can do these really, really big attacks. And I think, I think that it's your side, politically, that in large part makes it really difficult to say these things. To the degree that Obama or people around him even hinted at this suggestion, they just incur, the wrath of God from people like Sean Hannity and Dick Cheney and that kind of thing. But I actually think that among a lot of people who study this, I just talked to a couple of terrorism experts about this, fairly nonpartisan folks. I think that is the general view, particularly when it comes to attacks inside the United States. The bad news is that we found that there are a bunch of American Muslims who want to do us harm, and there have been a bunch of them recently. But I think the good news is that their ability to do us harm, whether it was that guy Zazi who wanted to try to, blow up something in Manhattan, seems to be kind of limited to kind of Timothy McVeigh level. Now, you could say that would be a catastrophe for the United States economically and in various other ways, but it's not. It doesn't look like it's going to be another 9/11.
Yeah, well, I'm still thinking it through, but I think that there is a sort of disconnect between a lot of the rhetoric. And, maybe you're right that it's generally from the right about the sophistication of Al-Qaeda, although it seems to me there is now a sort of bipartisan, particularly inside the Beltway, national security industry, that is.
Yes, I think that's right, and Homeland Security industry, which is very much a part of it.
Yeah, but so let me sort of put a pin in that for a second and just simply say that on the other side, the danger from Al-Qaeda on the home front might be less than some of my colleagues and maybe even me have said for a long time. I want to keep thinking it through. But that doesn't mean that the danger of jihadism is not as big a deal as some people are saying, right? Because, I mean, the Al-Qaeda, the argument about Al-Qaeda, the stuff that Peter Berger and these other guys have written, is that, the genius of it was that they basically decided to create this horizontal structure of franchisees who would go, sort of be self-starters and get a little maybe seed money from Al-Qaeda or a little how-to help, but basically work on their own. So it shouldn't be shocking that individual, the Al-Qaeda franchise in Yemen, it shouldn't be that shocking that it's less sophisticated than the Al-Qaeda franchise in Iraq was for a while, because they're working with different human capital and all the rest. The real danger, which was the danger that caused you and the New Republic back in the day to initially support the Iraq War, is that really bad guys, all it takes is one or two really bad, sophisticated guys on the inside of a government or a state to work to collude with some of these guys and really change the equation dramatically. If you have jihadists inside of Pakistan who can get close to the nuclear bomb, then that's a game changer. And the ability of this ideology to proselytize and garner support. I mean, you look at these polls where something, I don't want to get the exact numbers wrong, but, really scary numbers, third to half in some countries. People support suicide bombings, are sympathetic to jihad in one way or another. Some of those people are sophisticated. Some of those people do have keys to the rooms that you don't want them to have keys to. And the answer to all that, may not primarily be military, but that is a really serious and sophisticated threat that we have to deal with.
Well, yeah, but I guess I'm also thinking this through. But I mean, I don't think we should. When you're talking about nuclear, obviously, look, a nuclear bomb would be more than a game changer. But I think it's important to look at Iran, which is a very large country. It's a whole government. The whole country is a safe haven for the government of Iran. They've been trying to build one since the Shah was in power. They still haven't gotten there. This has been decades they've been trying to do it. It seems to be, it's really hard. And now you could try to buy one, but I think, from what limited I know, detonating a nuclear bomb has a lot more than with buying one. I mean, you need to buy one, and you have to have a lot of the scientists who know how to work it. I mean, in a way, we've had this government in Pakistan which has had these rogue elements sympathetic to jihadism for ages and ages now. And as far as we can tell, and we've had the former Soviet Union being, a pretty unregulated place. And as far as I can tell, I could be proven wrong tomorrow. These guys haven't really gotten anywhere. And on the chemical and biological front, I just think that the evidence so far is that you don't really kill a lot of people that way. I mean, to me, this is changing the subject a little bit. To me, one of the big questions is, does it matter, really? I mean, because on the one hand, you could say the anthrax attacks only killed 5 people, or Mudalib would have only killed, a couple hundred people. I mean, that sounds callous, but it's not a huge number of people. On the other hand, you can say it doesn't matter because the terror that it would create, which is the whole point, would itself be so economically and socially catastrophic that you don't need to kill that many people. That's the whole point. That if you do it in a frightening enough way, basically you can have terrible consequences for the United States. And that's why the threat is really, really, really so severe, even though the number of actual people that Al-Qaeda could kill is not that high.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. Look.
But then the question is, how much can we regulate? I mean, how much can we regulate our response? Is the question. Is that response become automatic, or could we get to a state where we're more able to take it in stride?
Well, look. One of my favorite phrases is America can choke. Chokes on a gnat. America can choke on a gnat, but it swallows tigers whole. It can. When push comes to shove, America is incredibly resilient and can withstand a lot. But on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't like inconveniences, and it doesn't like it doesn't like security threats. And it seems to me that that was my problem with Napolitano. I don't think she was to blame for this guy getting on a plane. But her reaction to this, that whole system works mantra, and the sort of, nothing to see here, folks, response, combined with her past rhetorical and otherwise, and her record generally, seemed to suggest to me pretty obviously that she was just very ill suited for that job. But regardless, I think you're right though that the costs of these things are measured not just in the lives they lose, and I think killing 300 people should still be considered a pretty big deal, but the knock-on effects. This guy was unsuccessful, and the costs of this attack already are going to be racking up in terms of, I'm sure, many billions of dollars in terms of lost productivity, lost tax dollars spent, and all of the rest. And if I were in Al Qaeda, I would consider this a successful. It's still a successful attack as far as they're concerned. I mean, you've got the entire country, on pins and needles for 10 days, talking about nothing else other than this guy, and taking Al Qaeda very seriously again. I mean, that was a
But I guess for me that raises the question. I mean, does that? I mean, I think you're right. I mean, this has been kind of wall-to-wall coverage, on TV ever since. But is that how much of that is because basically this has been fueled by people who want to keep talking about this, and to what degree are the American people actually rising up and demand? I mean, how much of this is really organic in the sense that this is the inevitable response to something like this, and how much of it is in a certain kind of way self-inflicted in the sense that we lather ourselves up into an hysteria about it, thus in some ways making the problem worse than it would be if we managed to be a little bit more, if we managed to see it a little bit more in perspective. I mean, I'm thinking about this because I was on CNN last night with some woman, I can't remember her name, and I said, I literally said, I don't think we should be hysterical about the threat, and she said, yes, we should be hysterical. So, I was, so I guess, that's, anyway, I'm not totally sure where I come down on this, but I don't know how much of this is within our control.
Sorry for the dog barking.
I see. He's hysterical.
My dog vociferously disagrees with your anti-hysteria views.
This is not the first time that he's tried to interrupt our conversations.
Actually, what I think it means is that there's a uniformed representative of the government coming to our door in terms of a postman.
I see. I see the black helicopter crowd.
Why don't we move on to other issues and talk a little bit, looking forward. And I don't know if this is going to be rank punditry or rank social commentary, but why don't we talk about what's about moving forward in 2010 and beyond? How do you see the year to come?
Well, I think it's probably going to be a pretty lousy year for Obama. I mean, I think that, and I think to some degree, one of Obama's challenges will be to kind of deflate expectations so people kind of expect that it's going to be a lousy year and acknowledge that to some degree it's kind of part of the structure of a presidency for the second year to be lousy. I mean, the Democrats are definitely going to lose seats, particularly in the House in the midterm elections. I mean, I'm not a Charlie Cook level of kind of going race by race, but it seems to me, there's no doubt they're going to be, at least probably lose 20 or 30 seats. I think the challenge for Obama is going to be to try to get the idea out there that that's really that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a biblical commentary on him and his administration, but the economy sucks. Presidents usually lose in the midterms in their first midterms, and the Democrats had two big wins in a row. So they won 2006 and 2008. So it's not surprising that they got a lot of people in some seats that would not naturally be hospitable to Democrats, and some of those people are going to be wiped out in the tie. Just like Reagan, the Republicans lost big in the House in 1982 after winning big in 1980, and I also think it's just unlikely that Obama is going to be able to have a lot of big domestic accomplishments. I mean, I think I think he's had some pretty big ones in his first year. The stimulus was really big. I think he's probably going to get something on health care, which will be really, really big. But I think he's kind of run out his string. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of George W. Bush when he tried to do Social Security privatization. I think it was a bridge too far. He'd already had a lot of big successes, but I think Obama's not likely to have really big successes on cap and trade, even much as I wish he would. And so I think that, there's probably going to be a bunch of articles saying that, Obama is kind of running out of steam in Congress a little bit, and so I think it's going to be a rough year for Obama. But I think that people should keep it in perspective, because I think if the economy really improves, then I think he could still be in pretty good shape for re-election. Particularly because I just don't think the Republicans right now have a lot of potential presidential candidates who have a lot of really strong crossover appeal.
Yeah, I generally agree with a lot of that stuff, which is going to annoy my wife, who wants me to mix it up more on these things.
And not to mention annoying Cosmo.
Yeah, that's right. Let's not get him riled up. I agree it's going to be a bad year for Democrats. It's going to be a bad year for Obama for basically the reasons you lay out. I don't know if the Republicans are going to take back the House. My guess is probably not, but they'll get really close. And even if they only get the low end of expectations, which is 20 seats, that is a pretty big blow to Pelosi's governing coalition for anything major. If you just look at what she had to do in terms of health care, she doesn't have that much wiggle room to begin with. And I'm not even. I'm not 100% convinced that they're going to get health care. I think they probably will, but I think it's a more open question than a lot of people in Washington think it is.
Well, if they didn't get health care, then I think that would change things. That would make 2010 not a bad year, but a catastrophic year.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah, that's the rosy scenario. You're right. And I think a lot does hinge on the economy. I think that some conservatives are getting themselves into a position that out parties often get into. I think Democrats are just as guilty of this in the past, of putting too many of their hopes on a crummy economy. And the business cycle is bigger than the White House, and it's bigger than Washington, and it's entirely possible that we'll do pretty well coming out of this recession like we have out of most recessions. And if that happens, I don't think the Democrats on the merits should be able to claim all that much credit for it. I think the stimulus probably has been a net economic drain on the economy, and it was bad. I don't think the healthcare reform stuff, if it does all the wonderful things that you guys say it will do, it won't do it for a while. And so I don't think you're going to be able to take credit. The healthcare stuff isn't going to be responsible for an upsurge in the economy. But that's presidents take credit for good economies, and they unfairly get blamed for bad economies, and there's always some merit to it, but less so than people like to think.
And what the Fed has done has been a big deal. Now, that's not been under Obama's control, but
right.
I think that's a really important part of an equation in terms of understanding government policy.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Sure. But I think the real trick is lays in Republican hands. If Republicans can roll out a plausible narrative about themselves, about not just what they're against, but what they're for. I think it could be a very, very, and if what they're for is the right message, obviously, I think it could be a very, very good year for Republicans come 2010.
So what is it? Because, if Republicans do have a big victory in the fall, even if they don't quite take Congress, it will cast the media spotlight on Eric Cantor or whoever, in the way, and they will have the platform for at least a while to articulate this message. During the elections and then particularly afterwards. And so what's it going to be? What is that compelling story?
Well, there's a lot of, there are a lot of inchoate ideas about what that story is and should be and all of the rest. Personally, I think, there is a very strong conservative argument against the sort of big business, fat cat, Wall Street stuff that goes along the lines of big business and big government are in bed together. And I think independents, if you look at the polling, are pretty open to that line of argument. If you look at what Obama has done in terms of these the way he's treated these Wall Street banks, the way he's treated GM and Chrysler and all the rest, that there is a very plausible argument to be made that the White House is on the side of big business. And it depends on how the stuff with the health insurance companies plays out. You hear a lot of competing arguments about whether or not the health insurance companies love Obamacare or don't love Obamacare. But if it really does look like what a lot of people claim it is, like even Howard Dean claimed it is, which is a huge wealth transfer to the big insurance companies, which the Obama administration has spent a lot of money demonizing. I think that could be a real problem. So I think one of the things the Republicans should do, and I think they should do this on the merits, but even more so if they can sell it as a winning issue, is get back on the side of sort of an anti-establishment, an intellectually serious anti-establishment populist message. That means co-opting the Tea Parties rather than letting the Tea Parties dictate the message. And then, we've talked about the deficit a bunch of times. Deficit is a really weird political issue because I don't think people actually care about the deficit per se. What they care about is the symbolism of the deficit, in the sense that the society is out of control. And so whenever social indicators and the rest are going bad, people start to emphasize the deficit in ways that they didn't when times were going well. And there's some economic merit to that. If you're growing, you can chart an easy path about how to get rid of the deficit. If you're contracting, you can't. But I think that getting on the right side of deficit reduction makes a lot of sense. The Republicans have the basic problem that they completely screwed up their brand. And I'm one of these guys who's said for a long time that the Republicans deserved to lose in 2008. My only problem was that in the two-party system, when you throw one set of bums out, you have to throw the other set of bums in. And so, what would be nice to see is a Republican Party that actually seems to live up to its convictions a little bit more. I think it's got the philosophy worked out. It's actually dealing with the corrupting effects of governing and being in power that are the problem.
Yeah, I guess not surprisingly, I find all that a little bit more difficult to do and intellectually honestly than you do. It seems to me that, if you really want to slash the deficit, obviously Republicans don't want to raise taxes, so they don't want to look for new sources of revenue. They don't want the defense and homeland security, which have been which are the things that really, aside that's the discretionary spending that really has really grown in the last decade. That's sacrosanct, and so it seems to me then, I just don't think you can find a huge amount of money in discretionary domestic spending. And if Republicans want to go after, entitlement spending, if that's done the right way, I think that there does need to be restraint in the growth of Medicare. But the last time I checked, the Republican Party was attacking Obama for trying to look for savings in Medicare, and I just think that it testifies to the larger point, which Gingrich realized, which is that going after these popular entitlement programs is very, very, very politically treacherous to do. So I just don't know. I agree with you that I think the Republicans are going to make hay in this Perot-esque way in 2010 about the size of the deficit. I just don't know whether I think that they're going to be able to do much about it that's really effective. And on the other point about attacking big business, I always just wonder, how is the Chamber of Commerce going to feel about this? This is a very important part of the Republican Party coalition, which is business, and not just small business, but just business. And I just wonder, this is the party that's constantly talking about class warfare, and how compatible is that with the kind of populism that you're talking about?
I agree with you. It's not going to be easy. Then again, look, the Democratic Party has been demonizing pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies and Wall Street for decades, and that didn't stop any of those guys from bellying up to the trough and getting in bed with the Obama administration in 2008 and 2006 with the Democratic Party. The hedge fund guys gave more money. Wall Street's been giving more money to Democrats than to Republicans for a while now. Some of that has to do with the social liberalism of a lot of these guys, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that these guys don't mind regulation nearly as much as a lot of the left's talking points make it sound like. And it seems to me that the real problem with Republicans is that they're such frickin' cheap dates. They constantly confuse this idea of being pro-market with being pro-business. Being pro-business is not necessarily being pro-market. And I think that, if anything, the Obama experience has shown that these guys are fully capable of taking a lot more punishment and a lot more grief from the Washington establishment, and still curling up to those in power. And my sense is that if the National Chamber of Commerce has a problem with some of that, and they would have a problem with some of it, a lot of the local chambers of commerce, a lot of the state-based and town-based and city-based chambers of commerce might actually like the idea of Washington of Washington sort of, in effect, taking a lot of the restrictions that are holding back small and mid-sized business from succeeding in this country. Because right now we have this view that that we have to help the really giant big businesses if we like economic growth. But the real entrepreneurs, the real champions of the free market are small and mid-sized independent businesses that aren't in the business of sort of rent-seeking and bribing government to get the laws that they want.
So in terms of policy implications here, what you're basically saying, this would not be an agenda. This would be an anti-regulatory agenda, right? I mean, this is basically, that you want fewer regulations. You don't want new, tougher regulations on Wall Street. You want to reduce regulations on Wall Street. You just also don't want to bail Wall Street out, right? You basically want Wall Street.
Well, there would be the reduction of some regulations, I would be in favor of allowing, buying insurance across state lines so there's actual real competition. I love all the supporters of single-payer health care talking about how they're really in favor of choice. But it would also be, in my ideal world, it would be a really rigorous attack on corporate welfare. The most problematic one, which everybody discovers and everyone talks a big game about. I mean, there's no better alliance between the libertarian right and the green left than on the consensus that agricultural subsidies are just a disaster. That's a really hard one because you have all these red states that are sucking at the teat of Washington. But I would love to have a vigorous campaign of getting rid of that stuff. But that's But again, I agree with you. It would be very hard for the Republicans to do all this. But the trick right now for the Republicans is simply effectively saying no, and people who criticize that don't appreciate how good it's been for Republicans so far. I think that it is a necessary but not sufficient thing. Saying no to all the stuff that Obama's been doing has been the right position. And then you have to have the and therefore what? And I think those guys are working pretty hard on it. But they have not rolled it out as a coherent political campaign. My guess is, from the conversations I've had with people on the Hill and whatnot, that you're going to see something like a Contract with America agenda. But that's going to be much later in 2010.
Well, something to look forward to, I guess. Maybe we should call it an afternoon.
I guess so, unless you're watching this in the morning somewhere.
That's right.
Anyway, it's great to see you, Peter. I hope we can do this again.
Absolutely. My
apologies for the animal intrusions. You didn't see the cat make an appearance, but she did as well. So.
You have all these ringers you bring in on your side. I'm gonna have to try to figure out how to counter this somehow.
Yeah, you should bring out your pet turtle or something. All right, Peter. Good to see you, and let's do this again.
Great.